The 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age, was an age of political and dramatic change. People from coast to coast bought the same goods, used the same slang, listened to the same music, and did the same dances. It was difficult for many Americans to get used to this new urban culture, and for most people, the 1920s brought more problems than celebration. On the other hand, for a small handful of young people in the nation's big cities, the 1920s were roaring without a doubt. The Jazz Age is defined as the period between the end of World War I and the beginning of the Depression, during which jazz became popular. African Americans began migrating to northern cities like Chicago and New York in search of better opportunity. With them, they brought the sounds of jazz and blues. Young Americans began to embrace this new style of music by listening and dancing to jazz and blues. This represented a rebellious attitude against their parents' old-fashioned views. Because radios and records were available, this encouraged the popularity and growth of jazz music. Jazz went from being played only in New Orleans to becoming a sensation in many American airwaves, dance halls, and homes. Louis Armstrong was a strong force in spreading the influence of jazz throughout his life. During his childhood, he learned that music could lead to fame and money. When he was a child, he and his friends would sing for nickels and pennies on the streets of New Orleans. At the age of 12, he was caught firing a gun into the air and was sentenced to a boys' home. From living in this home, Armstrong learned how to play the cornet and was soon playing at picnics and parades. About 9 years later, he was invited by his mentor, Joe King Oliver, to join Creole Jazz Band in Chicago, which was one of the best and most influential jazz bands in Chicago of that time. After quitting Oliver's band in 1924, he accepted an invitation to play for the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra in New York. They were considered the most popular African American band of the 1920s. For almost a year, he worked in Fletcher Henderson's band in New York, and he eventually returned to Chicago, where he played with orchestras and came out with some of the most important recordings of his life. He eventually became a part of Lil Hardin Armstrong Band and came up with record-breaking hits one after another. Some of his major hits of the 1920s were Potato Head Blues, Muggles, and West End Blues. All these hits set a standard for jazz for years to come. Just like African Americans, women had more freedom than ever before. Flappers are probably the highlight of the jazz age. A flapper was defined as a young woman with bobbed hair and short skirts who smoked, drank, and did things that were considered unladylike. Even though most women were not doing those things, many of them adapted to the new fashion styles. One thing that seemed to contribute to these rebellious actions were the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment allowed women the right to vote, and this was something that many women always wanted to do. Although there was a lot of freedom with women and African Americans, a lot of things were being banned. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect. This amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverage in the United States and its possessions, and started the Prohibition era. Because people could not buy alcohol illegally, they went to illegal speakeasies instead of the normal bars. The speakeasies were controlled by bootleggers, racketeers, and other criminals. One of those criminals was Al Capone. Al Capone moved to Chicago in 1920, where he worked for one of the leading figures in the underworld, Johnny Torrio. After being nearly killed, Torrio handed his business over to Capone because he was so good at what he did. Within 2 years of being in charge, Capone earned $60 million a year from alcohol sales alone. In 1931, Capone was finally arrested for tax evasion and was sentenced to 11 years in jail. Capone was the main reason for all the occurring violence in Chicago, and it was the best thing to get him off the streets. Just like alcohol was banned, so was the teaching of evolution. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, saying that all modern animal and plant life descended from a common ancestor. This theory conflicted with the Bible's teachings on the beginning of life. John T. Scopes was a teacher in Tennessee who became famous for going on trial for teaching evolution. Scopes was part of an American Civil Liberties Union attempt to challenge the state law that prohibited people to teach evolution. His trial became a national sensation, and Scopes was eventually fined $100, and his conviction was eventually overturned. Scopes' trial proved that the city saw him as a hero, while the small town saw him as a criminal. Scott Fitzgerald was one of the greatest literary figures of the 1920s. In April of 1920, at the age of 23, Fitzgerald published his first novel, The Side of Paradise, making him an overnight literary sensation. He moved his family to Great Neck, Long Island, after he expected to get rich from his play The Vegetable. Because of the many distractions from Great Neck and New York, Fitzgerald began drinking, and this slowed down the publishing of his third novel. Since he had a reputation of drinking, many literary reviews failed to give him a chance because they felt that he would be an irresponsible writer. In the spring of 1924, they moved to France to find a better place for him to work. There he began writing The Great Gatsby. He didn't finish The Great Gatsby until 1924 to 1925 in Rome. The Great Gatsby marked a striking advance in his technique, making use of complex structure and controlled narrative point of view. His achievement received critical praise, but sales of Gatsby were disappointing, though the stage and movie rights brought them additional income. Although The Great Gatsby wasn't a great hit when it first came out, this novel sells about 300,000 copies a year. The Jazz Age was a time where both African Americans and women were allowed to be more outgoing. African Americans could express themselves in poetry, dance, and music. Women were allowed to vote. They wore revealing and more stylish clothes, and they were allowed to do things that men were allowed to do. The banning of alcohol caused a lot of illegal and violent activities, along with the banning of teaching evolution. The Jazz Age was a time where people did things without thinking of the consequences. African Americans, flappers, Louis Armstrong, Al Capone, John T. Scopes, and Scott Fitzgerald are all perfect representatives of the Jazz Age and everything it stood for.